Yeah, quick introduction. I'm Avinash. I work at Platformatory, where we work with customers on their data streaming journey, work with their real-time data. We primarily work with Kafka, Flink, ClickHouse, amongst others. One of the things that we do is help people migrate from one to another. So this is one thing that we've done in the past. So we want to share our experience journey and how would someone approach doing something like this. Yeah, if you look at the real-time OLAP space, right, there's three names that emerge when you are trying to evaluate any software for real-time OLAP. Among those, there's Pinot, Druid, and ClickHouse. If you look at the community in all of these, there's a significant adoption of ClickHouse just by looking at the GitHub stars or even the general community in general, right? There's significant adoption of ClickHouse. ClickHouse stands out for various reasons, some of which we'll cover, and you'll also hear from the other speakers, and we've previously heard as well. There's also some other honorary mentions like Apache Doris or Firebolt. There's a lot of real-time OLAP, real-time analytics solutions out there. But there are reasons why ClickHouse stands out, and one would want to maybe adopt ClickHouse from another solution such as Druid, and then we'll talk about how do you go about doing that. Yeah, mandatory asterisk reference. Anybody who reads asterisks here? But the idea is okay. That's great. Yeah, the idea is we want to move out of Druid for reasons. Although Druid is a wonderful technology, it does what it does well. But there are reasons one would want to move out, which we'll talk about. Yeah, and migration is not really an easy story. Migrating any distributed system, any data infrastructure from one to another, it's not really easy. It's not something someone would want to do overnight, or just a decision that someone would want to take. You would want to clearly evaluate the needs for doing the migration, and also have a clear plan on how you would achieve that. Before we talk about the migration, or just migration, we'll also cover the key differences in the architecture. I think it's important to understand how Druid, how the Druid architecture is set up, and how ClickHouse is set up. When you're migrating from Druid to ClickHouse, you'd want to understand these architectural differences so that you can either tune your queries or do the migration successfully. On a very high level, Druid, there's three layers. There's the data layer, the query layer, and the control layer. There's a lot of components in the Druid architecture. I'm not going to be talking about all of them, but the general idea is it's a big distributed system. There's the data layer, where you have the historicals from which the data is queried, and the query layer, where the brokers make the query, handle the queries. And in the master or the control layer, you have the coordinators, which talk to Zookeeper for the coordination, and all of the data that is in the historicals is also stored in deep storage for backup and for long-term retention. Coming to ClickHouse, it's a much simplified architecture where you have the ClickHouse servers that act as both the data layer and the query layer, and you also have the ClickHouse Keeper, or Zookeeper previously, where you could which is used for the coordination among the various replicas of the ClickHouse servers that are running. So this is a vastly simplified architecture where you would want you can run ClickHouse all within a single binary without having to manage multiple services. And coming to adoption of ClickHouse, we previously saw about some of the ClickHouse Cloud features, but we've seen that ClickHouse Cloud is the easiest way to get started or adopt or run ClickHouse, where there's some significant differences from the open source version. Although the open source version is great, for example, if you want to do scaling, you would want to manually rebalance the servers. All of that is handled by ClickHouse, and there's a lot more which we've previously heard of, right? Yeah, coming to the migration, how would you want to go about the migration? There's primarily three aspects you would want to look at when planning the migration. There's the ingestion layer of how data is ingested, and the querying layer, how the various clients are querying the data, and finally, how do you manage the whole thing, the control plane aspect of it. Uh, Yeah, for the ingestion with Druid, there's you would have to write the ingestion spec for depending on the source that you are querying. The equivalent in ClickHouse would be to just use one of the if you're running it on ClickHouse Cloud, you would use ClickPipe, or if you're running it on open source, you would want to use maybe an ingestion engine or any of the connectors that are out there. I'll primarily talk about from the Kafka perspective, from how do you do the same with Druid and with ClickHouse. So with Druid Kafka ingestion, you would have to write the ingestion spec for Kafka and define any tuning there. But with ClickHouse, there's the Kafka ingestion engine that you can adopt to ingest, and the interface is all in SQL without having to rely on another language to define the ingestion spec. Everything is done over SQL in ClickHouse. Coming to querying, ClickHouse, or rather Druid, we'll talk about Druid first. Druid has its JSON over HTTP querying interface, which is the first class citizen there, and also supports Druid SQL, which under the hood translate to the native queries using Apache Calcite. But in the case of ClickHouse, it's all SQL. So if you're using Druid SQL, the migration might be a little simpler. You don't really have to do a lot of translation from the Druid SQL to the ClickHouse SQL unless there's specific features that you want to use with the ClickHouse SQL format. Druid also supports the JDBC API. There's the equivalent, somewhat equivalent with the MySQL API, or even just the SQL interface with ClickHouse. If you're using the Druid native queries, there's no straightforward way to get them running with ClickHouse. There's no single shot straightforward way to do them with when you're migrating to ClickHouse. Although ClickHouse does have its own native API with the C++ client, but what is recommended is you use the SQL client once you migrate. So you would want to maybe have some translation layer from the Druid native query to SQL when during the migration. And Druid has the Java APIs. There's no equivalent here in ClickHouse, although ClickHouse does have the new gRPC API, which you can still use with Java, but I think Python is the first class citizen there for the gRPC clients. But when you're migrating to ClickHouse, I think the primary gotcha here is having to choose the table engine. For example, if you are doing rollups in Druid during ingestion, I think that needs to be handled here with ClickHouse, where you either use an aggregating merge tree or summing aggregate merge tree, so that the data is aggregated during ingestion. Since Druid offers rollups out of the box, with ClickHouse you would have to use the table engine accordingly. Or if you're using maybe the Kafka engine, you would want to create a materialized view that then writes it to an summing or aggregating merge tree. And one other key aspect here is with Druid, there's no concept of a primary key there. With ClickHouse, primary keys are very essential for the query performance. You would want to pick the right primary key for when you're migrating over, so that you have the best performance when you're querying. You would want to select the primary key for the columns that you are frequently querying. That's primarily the two major things that you have to keep in mind when in terms of your data schema when you're migrating over to ClickHouse. A quick comparison of the features that are in Druid and how would you, and something similar in ClickHouse. We spoke about the query interfaces, so I'm going to skip that. But if you're using any specialized SQL functions or specialized functions in Druid, I think the equivalent with ClickHouse you would have to write an UDF to achieve the same. For example, there's a time flow in Druid. There's nothing really equivalent with ClickHouse, but although achievable with UDF. And I think just the general adoption of ClickHouse is much simpler. There's a lot less learning curve. So I think the migration, once the migration is done, onboarding new engineers would be a simple fact. Otherwise, if you're using, just reiterating on the fact that if you're using SQL in Druid, I think the migration is pretty much straightforward with ClickHouse for the most part. Yeah, just to recap and have an overview, I think we primarily need to break down the migration into two parts where you decide, where you first look at the ingestion APIs for Druid and do the equivalent here in ClickHouse. So since ClickHouse there's no separate APIs for ingestion and querying, you would also define the ingestion layer with SQL and make sure you set the right table engine. If you're using any of the integration engines, then maybe use a materialized view to set the right table engine that will be then used for querying. And with querying, I think it's better to get an inventory of who are the clients for the Druid server, so that you can then have a plan for migrating them over to ClickHouse. I think if you're using SQL, that's straightforward. But if you're using the native query for Druid, I think an API shim layer where that does the translation from the native queries to SQL is somewhat is an approach that can be used. Maybe with the help of an LLM that can be that can help with the translation layer there, an API gateway that sits in between. Since all of this is over HTTP, you can achieve that with an API gateway that sits in between and does the translation. And regarding planning the migration, I think it should be done at one single context at a time, one bounded context at a time. You migrate certain functionality, certain specific set of functionality from over to ClickHouse and run some benchmarks, run some. You also check for the performance compared to Druid and do any necessary tuning. For example, maybe the primary keys were not the right ones based on the query, or even if the primary keys were wrong, maybe use a projection to set the right column that is queried and tune the queries so that the performance is, for the most part, you should see the performance over in ClickHouse is much better. But in case that needs tuning, you can always do that with projection or setting the right primary keys. And do this in phases and repeat rinse. Finally, just to cut over once all of the queries are migrated over and you have the right benchmarks and you are pretty much convinced with the performance. Yeah, that's a quick rundown on how you would go about doing it, but I'm happy to chat about it later. I'll be around, happy to talk more. Yeah. Thank you.